So listen, obviously,
Yeah.
as Joe, as you mentioned, a lot of people that are Alabama fans, and really not just Bama fans, Joe. I think that there was this narrative around national media too that I don't want to say that Bill O'Brien was in over his head or he stunk or whatever, but there was always a narrative around him. I think that narrative started when obviously he was with the Texans. He traded DeAndre Hopkins for a packet of ketchup and a peanut butter sandwich. But now, like when you look at Bill O'Brien, DeAndre Hopkins might get traded from the Cardinals, okay? Like they're wanting to move on from him now because he's a locker room issue. That's right. Two teams that have said that he's a locker room issue. That's the stigma that Bill O'Brien has to go through. But let me tell you why it's not justified for Alabama fans to want him to be fired. You ready? 2022, Alabama was fourth in scoring with 41.4 points per game. They were 11th in total offense, 477 yards per game, 18th in passing, 24th in first downs. That's just last year. In 2021, though, Joe, here when they made the national championship, they averaged 39.9 points per game. That was sixth best in the country. 338 yards per game in the air, 150 yards rushing. That was led by Brian Robinson Jr. Over the last 2 years, Bryce Young, one of the former Heisman Trophy winners, only threw for 8,000 yards, 79 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions in that time frame. Bill O'Brien was never the problem. I don't think Alabama had a Bill O'Brien problem. I think that Alabama had a Nick Saban and disciplinary problem. Here's why. They were 126th in penalties, second worst in the SEC behind Tennessee, who had 105 total penalties, or 105 rate. Alabama had 103. They were 63rd in time of possession, and they were 45th in giving up sacks. Here's another reason why it wasn't a Bill O'Brien problem and maybe more of a Nick Saban problem. In 2021, Alabama had two wide receivers that had over 75 catches. Jamison Williams had 79 catches, 1,500 yards, 15 touchdowns. John Mechie had 96 catches, 1,142 yards, and 8 touchdowns. The leading receiver this year was Jermaine Burton with only 40 catches. I think that my point in all of this is they did not have the weapons on the outside this past season to where you can go up against a Georgia or a Tennessee to ultimately take head. But this is the ultimate reason why everybody blames Bill O'Brien, and they shouldn't, and maybe why they should give some blame to Nick Saban. 2 games you lost this year, LSU and Tennessee, and a third one you almost lost to in Texas. Joe, against Texas, they had 15 penalties for 100 yards, 9 penalties against LSU for 92 yards, and here's the kicker. The game that they should have never lost, Tennessee, 17 penalties for 130 yards. In those 3 games, they had 41 penalties for 322 total yards. You don't have a Bill O'Brien problem, or you didn't have a Bill O'Brien problem. You had a Nick Saban and disciplinary problem. There are times where everybody looks at Saban as the pinnacle. They should. He's the greatest college football coach of all time, but he is not above reproach. No coach, no player is above reproach. So you mean to tell me that they can continue to have these issues of penalties and time of possession, but nothing falls back on Nick Saban? That's ludicrous. Absolutely ludicrous, in my opinion, when you can have all these statistics and everything pointing to Bill O'Brien being a pretty damn good offensive coordinator, and you say it's his problem. Joe, giving up 332 yards and penalties in 3 games, let me tell you what it's not. It's not a Bill O'Brien problem. You know what else isn't a problem? Not having and recruiting the weapons on the outside. Jamison Williams and John Mechie went down. They had a wide receiver problem in 2021 national title game when those guys went down. What did they do? They were like, hey, Jermaine Burton's out here. Let's go after Jermaine Burton. Maybe he could solve the problem. He doesn't. But here is the ultimate cherry on top of all of this. Their offensive line play has been subpar at best over the last 2 seasons. Now, Alabama fans will come at me and scream and say, well, Blake, you scheme up to that. Scheme it to whom? Because there were times in the season that Jabari Gibbs was your best wide receiver. That's not a Bill O'Brien problem. Bill O'Brien did what he needed to do. He signed Ty Simpson. He signed the kid from Louisiana, why is his name from Zachary? Why is it Eli Holstein?
Yeah.
He signed great quarterbacks to get there. He even had to completely change offenses when Jalen Milroe entered the conversation. You don't have a Bill O'Brien coordinator problem. You have a disciplinary problem. You know who didn't have a disciplinary problem, Joe?
Who?
Georgia. Alabama was one of 2 teams in the country in the last 2 years that the total offense and total defense ranked in the top 15. Everybody looks at Georgia as what? The pinnacle.
Yeah.
They look at Alabama as down. The only different statistic between the both of them, I told you we were going to do this blind comparison. They are almost equal in everything that they do. Maybe not so much defensively, but offensively, Alabama has been a little bit more above them.
Right, understandably.
You know what the number one thing that Georgia doesn't do? They don't commit dumb penalties.
Yeah.
Now, I rest my case. As your boy said, Jim Carrey said in Liar, Liar, Jordan fades back, swish, and that's the game. Your Honor.
So, Blake, I think you actually illustrate a really good argument. And like I said, I agree with you on, I think, 95% of that argument. And I think very good points. And let's take a step back here for a second to understand maybe why Bill O'Brien was so hated. He was disgracefully removed from the NFL. Everybody clowned on Bill O'Brien for all the moves that he made as the GM head coach of the Houston Texans. So it was almost a joke that he was removed from the NFL as a head coach and then hired in this position. It was the go-to remark of like, oh, it's the home for wayward coaches. If you failed in your last destination,
the rehabilitation center is what they call it. Right.
Exactly. So he's already coming in with a negative stigma after failing so horribly in the NFL. So there's already going to be a stigma. And I think you add into that the automatic expectation to win national championships is going to make it so hard. So the overall feeling towards Bill O'Brien, he was set up for failure. I think the reason why, because you make a really fantastic argument, I think the reason why Alabama fans didn't like him is that they already came in being worried about him. And then because he didn't win a national championship, because he didn't win those important games, that is why that they weren't satisfied with the results. So it makes total sense if we're just thinking from a psychological standpoint from those Alabama fans. Now, the one thing I just want to toss in there, and you brought it up with the recruiting, I think my concern is with the fact that who places the blame and who receives the blame for that lack of explosive talent at the receiver position.
It's got to fall on Nick. It's got.
But he's the offensive coordinator. Like, he has some say in the quarterback coach.
No, it's not. No, it's not. Not when you get to a situation where Nick is known as the elite recruiter. And here's another thing. Is there not a position coach? Alabama's wide receiver coach, his name slips my mind. I think it's Coach Wilcox. Okay, yeah. He's the assistant head coach. Why is he not the one to blame? Now, they went out and got Aaron Anderson from Louisiana. They went out and got explosive players. Coordinators do not hit the road, Joe, recruiting during the bye week and during the season like the position coaches do. They just don't.
I understand that, but at the same time, these young receivers and guys in the transfer portal.
Thank you, Wiggins.
Okay, sorry. You're talking about the receivers coach is the name, right? These young players, these guys in the transfer portal, part of it, yes, is the relationship you establish with the position coaches, but at the same time, the decision comes down to getting to play with a Heisman winning quarterback, and there should be some appeal of the offense that you're playing in. I think that there still is a role by the offensive coordinator in that recruitment to some extent. There has to have been something.
Are you going to put more blame on Bill than you do on Nick in that regard?
Because how much is Nick doing in that
all of
circumstance? You think that Nick is doing all of the recruiting of the receivers in this? I think
here's what I know for an absolute fact. Take it to the bank. Take it to Capital One if you want to, and cash that SEC check. I know for an outright fact that they have at least a 2-hour period per week, if not more, about them going down their recruiting board, and Nick Saban is leading that meeting. Okay. So if you're not recruiting at a high level and Nick Saban's in that room and you have a wide receiver issue, it falls ultimately on your head coach. If he's going to get all the praise for winning national titles, he's got to get the blame for not having the explosiveness. Now they went in the portal and got Jamison Williams. They recruited Mechie. They got Devonta Smith. Bill O'Brien had the least amount of weapons on the perimeter of all the coordinators.
Okay.
Sarkisian, and Kiffin. He had the least amount of weapons that he can get the ball to than any coordinator in the last 10 years under Nick Saban.
So all that is absolutely true. And I think for the results that he produced with those limitations is very, very promising, and it deserves recognition. But at the same time, the page flips to Bill O'Brien, and then suddenly they can't recruit receivers. I just don't understand what was the turnoff. And I'm not saying it's him necessarily in this circumstance, but who is the one who's turning these guys off? Because it's a massive drop off. It is a significant drop off in star rating, in talent, in actualized talent getting onto the field. It happened when Bill O'Brien stepped in. Again, I'm not saying that it is all 1,000% his fault, but strangely enough, it just suddenly is.
I disagree with that, because Jamison Williams comes into the fold.
He came being recruited by the previous coaching regime, was he not?
Which was Bill O'Brien. Bill O'Brien's been there since 2021. And here you can, the only thing, Joe, that I would concede is situational play calling with Bill O'Brien. I will concede some of it. Okay.
That was the other thing that I wanted to bring up, because the situational play calling is problematic. And I said this to you off air when we were talking beforehand. I was perplexed by the approach in the Tennessee game, and Bryce stepped up to the occasion, but the LSU game especially, where it just seemed like, hey, Bryce, you got to go win us this football game. We're going to keep throwing it first, second, and third down, and hopefully we can win this game. I don't think that was the best way to set up your team for success. I get that the kid won the Heisman Trophy, but you had three capable running backs, and Jahmyr Gibbs at one point was brought up as a Heisman candidate for a couple of weeks because of how good he was playing. I don't get why there were weeks where they were good enough to be top 4 in the country in rushing yards, and they were leaning on the run game, and then suddenly they're turning away from it in these big games. It's strange to me, and that's the other factor to this, why I understand why the frustration, where the frustration is coming from with Bama fans.
I think here's my ultimate conclusion for Alabama. Okay, yes, I'll give you situational play calling, but I also, when I look at this, you scored 31 points against LSU. You scored 49 points. Was it 40? I think it was 52-49 that Tennessee game. You scored 49 points against Tennessee. You literally had 15 penalties for 100 yards against Texas. You only won by a point. At some point, you have to take other things off of Bill O'Brien that is out of his control. Joe, I'll remember this vividly. They convert a first down. Alabama converts a first down, okay, but they have to go back because they have a holding call. They have to punt. LSU gets the ball. Jane Daniels goes down the field and scores. Same thing happened against Tennessee. Tennessee, in their first possession, if I'm not mistaken, if I recall correctly, they fumbled the football. And then Alabama would go down and score. My point is when you're averaging, Joe, offensively, they averaged 41.4 points per game offensively. And you're trying to sit here and tell me, oh, it's situational play calling. It's him not recruiting. Well, Alabama's never had an issue with recruiting. Alabama is Alabama. At some point, you got to take the stigma off of him and take all the pressure off of Bill O'Brien, because if you had an offensive coordinator that is not named Bill O'Brien, let's just call him Joe. Let's call him Joe Smith. If Joe Smith came to you right now in your favorite college football town and your favorite college football team, and he said, I was 4th in the country in scoring, I had a Heisman Trophy winner, we averaged 41 points, let's just call it 42 points per game, we were close to 500 yards per game, we were equally balanced at times, my quarterback had 8,000 yards passing. Oh, by the way, he's going to miss 4 games in the second year. He's going to throw for 79 touchdown yards. I'm going to literally get a wide receiver that hasn't caught a pass in college football 79 catches for 1,500 yards and 15 touchdowns, even though he tears his ACL and will go to Detroit. If his name wasn't Bill O'Brien, who would he be? Let me tell you what he'd be. he'd be a Broyles Award finalist.
Well, that's what I was saying earlier. And see, this is where it's really hard for me to sit here and have this conversation with you, is that there's parts of it that I want to sit here and talk about and dissect and agree with you, but I also want to acknowledge some of those complications. But that's what I was saying earlier, is that because of who he is, because of his name.
Is Bill O'Brien, to rudely interrupt you, answer this question, because we had this Monday. Is Bill O'Brien better offensive coordinator than Kendall Briles?
Yes. But yes, absolutely. That shouldn't be a question.
Everybody call Kendall Briles a witch or one of the best play callers in the country, but Bill O'Brien's a dud.
It's the stigma. It's the stigma because of his name and the negative results that he produced over the past 4 or 5 years, however long he was in Houston. I will say this to kind of pivot the conversation a little bit. I'm a little surprised that Bill O'Brien didn't get more opportunities as a head coach in college football, unless his intention was to get back to the NFL. That would make a lot of sense to me. But for him to not be in any of those interviews, to be really, he was, small murmurs, but to not be heavily recruited as a head coach at another institution, he was really good at Penn State. People forget how good Penn State was for the very, very short period of time that he was there. I do believe, and I do agree with you, that he has been shortchanged because of the stigma and the natural feeling towards him because of the lack of results. Actually, it's not even a lack of results, the massive failure with the Houston Texans.